Good evening. I'm Eileen Klein-Sorge, Dean of the College of Business, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this sustainability lecture. I want to thank all of you for coming out on this very blustery evening to join us. We couldn't be talking about a more important topic here tonight. To meet today and tomorrow's business needs, sustainability simply must be a part of the conversation. It is not only critical to the health of our environment, but it just makes good business sense. We know we must prepare our future business leaders to meet increasingly complex 21st century challenges. That's why in the College of Business, we have integrated the triple bottom line concepts of sustainability into our core curriculum rather than making it a standalone boutique elective. Through the Sustainability Initiative, we are making sure that every OSU College of Business graduate enters the business world with cutting-edge understanding of the environmental, community, and resource needs. That's also why we've invited the Climate Change Roadshow here tonight. This is a combined effort by Hewlett-Packard and the World Wildlife Fund to bring individuals from across the country into the climate change debate. Kicking off their presentation tonight will be Dr. John Matthews, Climate Change Adaptation Specialist with the World Wildlife Fund. Dr. Matthews' research has focused on how aquatic insects and migratory species would be impacted by climate change, and he has consulted and collaborated with a variety of researchers, agencies, NGOs, and landowners on conservation and climate change issues. His work with the World Wildlife Fund focuses on developing and implementing strategies for building resilience into our freshwater ecosystems. Following Dr. Matthews' presentations, Jay Celorie, our very own OSU graduate in engineering, will discuss what Hewlett-Packard is doing to respond to climate change. Before joining HP in 1998, Mr. Celorie was a senior project manager at CH2M Hill, where he directed multi-million-dollar environmental remediation projects. Now he is the Global Program Manager for Supply Chain Energy at HP, where he directs projects and programs to create transparent energy use and works with suppliers to reduce the company's overall carbon footprint. I know you're all as anxious as I am to hear what these accomplished men have to say, so let's get started with a warm welcome for Dr. John Matthews and Jay Celorie.
Thanks very much. My name is John Matthews. I also have a connection to Corvallis. I didn't have to travel too far. I live up on Witham Hill, and I had a postdoc ended just over a year ago that lasted about 6 weeks with Dr. Sue Haig here in the front with the USGS, and also with Dave Lytle in zoology. And then heard about this job and decided to take it. So I'm also a local. So tonight we're talking about climate change. It's a topic that is in the news very much right now, and I believe will be a major part of the news for at least the coming century. I suspect it's something that most of us will get to know a bit too intimately as time passes. And we're going to focus on it from really two different perspectives. I'm a biologist, and I work on an area called climate adaptation or climate change adaptation. And Jay is going to focus on an area called climate change mitigation or climate mitigation. Right now in the news, almost everything that you hear about is really focused on climate mitigation. Climate mitigation is just the idea that we have a lot of greenhouse gases that we're producing that go out into the atmosphere. We've been producing them on a large scale for about 200, 250 years. And what do we do about them? Are we able to pull some of those gases out of the atmosphere, and are we able to reduce the rate that we emit them in the future? However, even if we were to stop all greenhouse gas emissions on the planet today, the climate would still continue to change. That's something that a lot of people don't really understand, that the climate should have stopped changing because so many countries signed Kyoto, right? But that's really not true. Climate change is something that's already been happening. It's going to be happening. Sea level rise alone will continue for many centuries on the planet, even if we stopped all carbon emissions today. Also, we would probably see weird things happening in terms of precipitation and droughts and floods, at least over the next 40 or 50 years, again, with stopping all emissions today. So, I work for the World Wildlife Fund. We're about 4. Okay, thanks. Shouldn't have worn the magnetic shirt. And a lot of what we're trying to do with adaptation is to try to get people to understand that traditional approaches to sustainable development and to conservation have to be adjusted in some way. A lot of it is actually conversational development. That's really what I spend most of my time doing. We have a really nice site on panda.org, our website that is focused on climate witness, which is a really neat global program where people tell stories about how climate change is impacting them. And then we also, in terms of especially mitigation, we try to work with global activities to try to get the message out. Earth Hour is something that some of you may have heard about this past year. It involved 25 cities just turning off the lights at night in places like Melbourne, Australia. Several million people participated in that. Most of this is probably going to be review for the majority of you. The greenhouse effect is a natural effect of the atmosphere. The Earth and Mars are, even though it doesn't feel like it, they're more or less the same distance from the sun. Average temperature on Mars is a little bit below freezing. It doesn't really have a thick atmosphere. The Earth has a thick atmosphere. It's capable of capturing a lot of the Earth's energy, and that's what makes the Earth a place that has liquid water in lots of places and reasonably habitable for most of us. What we see with climate change, the anthropogenic element of climate change, is that we have most of that greenhouse effect is carbon dioxide or methane that's already in the atmosphere, both of those carbon-based gases. What we've been doing is producing a massive amount of extra carbon-based gases into the atmosphere. So even small activities like watching TV for a few hours takes several pounds of coal to be able to power your TV. And where does all that coal go? It goes straight into the atmosphere. Is climate change a new thing? Well, in the scheme of things, the climate's been changing over Earth's long history. And it's oscillated to much colder points than it is now and much warmer points. However, it has been a really long time since it is as warm as it is right now. And it's likely to get much, much warmer over a fairly brief period of time. So this is looking at various isotopes in ice core data. Most of the ice cores that people look at that are really thick are in Greenland or in Antarctica. And if you look at the shaded bars, those are interglacial periods. They're warm periods. And especially the bottom line is methane, the top line is CO2. You can see that over the last 650,000 years or so, we have CO2 and methane levels that are essentially unprecedented. And we now, in the last year and a half or so, have data that goes back even much farther than this. We really have to go back several million years before we start to see species, or including us, that have had any experience with the potentially warmer climate that we're heading towards. This is one of those standard slides that you have to put up for a climate change talk. This is from the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, the IPCC. This is looking at observed temperature changes over the past century. This image right here is also kind of a standard part of a climate change talk. It's called the hockey stick because it angles up at the end, and that's the annual global temperature. And it's fairly wobbly, but more or less straight for a really long time, and then starting about 150 years ago, and accelerating starting in the 70s, it shoots up. And you can see that there are lots of places, especially at high latitudes, and places like Australia and Southern Africa that have been warming up quite a bit recently. What can we expect to see? Well, the map on the left is from like the mid-2020s, and things will be a little bit warmer. This is all in degrees Celsius. 1 degree Celsius is about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. Looks like small changes. These again, this is annual temperature, annual air temperature. By the end of the century, we're likely to see much elevated temperatures. So some of those purples over there, we're talking about, in terms of annual temperature, about 10 to 15 degrees warmer on an annual basis. Precipitation. I focus on freshwater systems. I actually think that freshwater and precipitation are much more important for humans to be thinking about with climate change than air temperature. People can live in all sorts of strange places. They can live in Greenland and Iceland, though Iceland doesn't sound like such a nice place to live right now. They can live in deserts, Timbuktu, deserts of India. Australia often lived there for many tens of thousands of years. But water is really important, and people that live in those extreme environments are really focused on water. And the story here is complicated. Some places we actually see more precip, especially at high latitudes. But this big red spot there, that's actually quite disturbing. That's where the Amazon is. The Amazon is, in some models, is expected to see about half as much rain as it gets right now by the end of the century. That probably means that the Amazon won't be a big, tall, tropical wet forest. It's going to be a relatively dry tropical savanna, just a few scattered trees and a lot of grass. That's very different than what we think about for the Amazon. There are lots of other kinds of impacts that follow from the shifts in temperature and precipitation and all sorts of other climate variables. We see big shifts in forests in terms of how frequent fire occurs. You see that in the western U.S. already. Impacts to coastal areas with stronger, more frequent storms. Agriculture, in most of the central part of the U.S., we've seen wheat becoming ready earlier and earlier, and the wheat crop moving farther and farther north. Spread of malaria and dengue. Dengue is a really awful tropical disease. 20, 30 years ago, it was considered extremely rare in southern Texas. We're actually getting 50 to 100 cases a year now in southern Texas. It's that parasite begins to move north. So the ranges of things are spreading. And in my personal area, water resources. So most of these images are actually pictures that I took in northern India, one of the places where I work regularly, in the Gambhiri River Basin. It's a tributary of the Ganges. These are two colleagues that I work with. The one on the left is over 6 foot, and that little white mark up at the top is the water level in 1992 for the Gambhiri. This is a world-famous EFLOS expert, Jay O'Keefe, walking in a river that he was hired as a consultant to provide some management recommendations on. I think his biggest recommendation was it'd be nice to have a little water. The farmers in that area they have no water, so they have resorted to really terrible groundwater resource usage, and they're digging a well right there. All that smoke and haze is from the well pumps that they use that have no filter on them, so it makes the air really cloudy. And this image up in the top right, really depressing. It was taken from this bridge here. And in this part of India, it's a tributary of Ganga Ma, the Mother Ganges, where many people in southern Asia would like for their ashes of their relatives to enter the Ganges to seek purification in the cycle of lives. These are, all those little patches there are recent cremation sites where people have burnt their relatives' body, and they're hoping that someday they get rain, so the ashes will wash down the Ganga. Of course, there's also lots of impacts to species. In fact, that's really what started to alert us that climate change was very serious. The first species to go extinct was a frog in Central America that we know of in the early 80s. But there have been others that we've lost, and we're likely to lose a lot more, again, even if we stop all carbon emissions today. So what's happening in Oregon? Not very much. There it goes. Okay. So historically, what does Oregon look like? We have wet winters that we're just entering now, pretty dry summers. Most of the water that you see in rivers comes from snowpack, a little bit from glaciers, but mostly snowpack that tends to last over the course of the spring and summer. We've already realized about a 1.2 degree increase in annual mean temperature across the 20th century, and most of that is in winter. By about 2050, we can expect to see an annual mean temperature of another 5.5 degrees or so. The impacts from air temperature should be relatively mild compared to most of the rest of the U.S. Precip has increased as well over the course of the 20th century, with most of that increase actually in the eastern part of the state, out in the Great Basin. And that probably means that what we're going to have is wetter, less snowy winters, and because there'll be less snowpack, we'll have longer, drier summers. Sea level is actually increasing at a relatively faster rate than most of the U.S. Astoria has gone up, it doesn't seem like very much, a millimeter is not a lot, but on an annual basis that actually is a good bit. And there are lots of scary stories that I can tell you about the potential for very rapid sea level rise. This should be a great worry to people in Oregon about snowpack, that it's declined quite a bit just over a relatively recent period. And a lot of our weather is actually pushed along by these huge global scale climate engines like El Nino, or it's also called ENSO, or the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, and those seem to be altering. So a lot of you probably have heard about the dead zone that's off the Oregon coast. That's related to these large climate engines starting to shift their behavior and their patterns. What's happening to Oregon water resources in particular? What's probable, mean temperatures don't mean a lot to people. I don't think it's a good way to describe how people are being impacted. But one of the things that we're seeing in Oregon, and we'll see in lots of other places too, is both more droughts and more floods. It's more oscillation around the mean and more extremes around the mean. More summer heat waves that also tend to last longer and be a bit more extreme than they were before. And at high elevation, like if you go skiing, that's likely to be very different, just within a matter of a few years. More winter floods in particular. We're going to have really long periods without any precipitation. Potentially with drier rivers in summer, and this of course is going to impact salmon. In the Pacific Northwest, we've already lost a lot of our glaciers. Glacier National Park in 1900 had over 200 glaciers. One of them was over a mile thick. There's now a lake there. That glacier is completely gone. And we're expected to lose the last of them by 2015. So there's less than 20 now. If you want to see a glacier in the ill-named Glacier National Park, then you should go very soon. This is just a photograph of one of the really big ones that's essentially disappeared. But what does this mean for people? Well, in very practical terms, the California wine industry of Napa and Sonoma are likely to become an Oregon wine industry, and in some cases a Washington and BC wine industry. And the Californians are going to come with them. So California is already under drought stress on a consistent, regular basis. Schwarzenegger is very worried about it. I have a friend who's a consultant with Schwarzenegger on water issues there. They can't make water out of nothing. And this means that there's going to be a lot of hard choices. Dams probably are going to be important in some cases for water storage and cleaner power, but it also means that it's going to be harder and more stressful on the ecosystems of those rivers. They'll be less capable of adapting. And that means that Oregon fisheries are going to face, on a regular basis, the same difficult choices that they faced this year. And in light of shifting forest pest and fire regimes, forests will have to be managed in a different way than they are now. So what do you do about this? What is climate adaptation? I like to think of it as the brace yourself part of climate change. We can't make up precipitation. We don't have that kind of technology. We can't make things cooler in terms of air temperature or make heat waves less frequent. But we can start to think about where we're going to spend our conservation and sustainable development dollars in a wise way, and where are the places that are really worth protecting. And this is a map from NOAA looking at temperature anomalies in the oceans worldwide. And this is a region in the subset called the Coral Triangle, where it's actually, there's a lot of upwelling there. The water stays cooler there. Where probably we'll lose most corals globally within 50 to 80 years. But if you were going to put your coral conservation money on one spot that may still be able to maintain corals, then this cool upwelling would probably be the place. A lot of traditional conservation has really been focused on things like invasive species or overhunting, the fragmentation of habitat. That is one of the things that makes this period of climate change different than previous periods. That species were able to move around a lot more, including people, in terms of what they did, and they were able to shift when they did things. But it's much harder now because we've chopped up the landscape, we've added all these other stresses on ecosystems, including stresses on us. We insist that certain things must happen in certain places at certain times. So we have to be able to take some of those extra stresses off. We also need to be able to do what people in conservation biology refer to as adaptive management, which means that if you're not quite sure what you should be doing, then you do a little test, you look at the results, and then you keep going, and you try to get better over time. And that's important because we have a moving target now. Climate is altering things. And traditional conservation meant looking at the past and saying that's when things were better, and that's the target that we should aim for. But we can't really use that model anymore because that past is associated with the past climate. And that climate doesn't exist anymore. So we have to look forward. That's this image here of Janus, the Roman god. Two faces, one on the back of his head and one on the front of his head. I like to use that image to kind of encapsulate what climate adaptation is really about, looking forward and backward in time. But we also have to do climate mitigation, the topic of Jay's talk. We have to say there's some things that we can't save. Polar bears are toast. Their natural habitat within 50 years is going to be the San Diego Zoo. It's very simple. We've lost essentially their habitat. This field here is an alpine meadow, like you'd find in the high Cascades or in the high Rockies. And there are special flowers, there are special butterflies that are there. These are probably also toast. The species may not be extinct, but it's probably going to exist in some highly artificial, basically zoo and that if you're really lucky, your grandkids might be able to see them behind a glass plate. So that slide was really about the idea that we have to just slow down the rate of climate change. We have to do the climate mitigation. So WWF has a lot of adaptation projects globally. I work in the Pantanal in Brazil, the Ganges in India, the Yangtze in eastern China, and the Thames in the UK. And this is just a quick profile of the Yangtze Basin. It's a really big river. It's one of the longest rivers in the world, but it also is a massive river. It feels powerful the way that the Columbia does or that the Mississippi does. And 400 million people live there. And they really use that river. It's the industrial heartland. It's where most of the agriculture is. It's also a terribly polluted region. And the air quality most days is so bad you can only see a couple of miles. This is where China has become the modern China that we see economically. And its trajectory is only accelerating. The development pressure on this basin is likely to increase. And that's of serious concern with what's happening in terms of climate change for this region, and how it's going to affect the water quality, the timing of the water that flows through the Yangtze and all the lakes and wetlands in that area. So we have a really strong program in China, actually, that we're working on a lot of different areas. Oh, sorry. One of the first areas that we've decided to focus on are the traditional topics that trying to reduce these external pressures that we know are so horrible for the species and the people that are living in that area. About 55% of all the pigs on the planet live in China. And most of these are in farms that they're very concentrated. I visited them before. They hold about 50,000 pigs in each one, and they usually sit right on the edge of a wetland or a lake or a pond, and that flows right into the Yangtze. And that's a lot of nitrate, to use the euphemism. And it's a serious problem. The second largest pork producer in the world, by contrast, is the U.S. We only have about 8% of the world's pigs. So we're actually working with the pork farmers in that area and also the fish farmers. Fish farming is really big, especially with carp, to be able to have much more sustainable, less intensive pressures on the environment. We're working with the managers of Three Gorges Dam, currently the world's largest dam, although there are bigger ones that are being built now, to modify how it runs so that it runs in a healthier way for the whole of the main stem of the river. And we're trying to get people to invest in a way that says it actually is more important to me to have this an intact and healthy ecosystem for the future that I can actually make more money from, have a better livelihood. That somehow you can make fish and birds and insects become a marker for how well you were doing economically. It's very difficult, but it's what we have to do in places like China. You can't start the conversation in China by saying you need to conserve these resources. You have to say, I know how to give your kids a better life. We're also trying to protect high-quality habitat. With the Chinese government's been very cooperative with us. We helped create a network of about a massive new wetlands protected area network in the middle and lower Yangtze, roughly the size of Turkey. And we've also focused on particular species that are under serious threat. The Yangtze finless porpoise here at a breeding facility that I visited in the central Yangtze. Beautiful, that's a pregnant female. Her skin feels soft like an overstuffed chair. She chirps at you. Really beautiful creature. She's the mother to now several offspring that have been released into a captive oxbow nearby. We've already lost one of the two cetacean species in the Yangtze. We don't want to lose the other one. Thanks very much.
All right. Thank you, Dean. It's a pleasure to be here tonight, and it's a pleasure to represent HP and talk about how HP is responding to climate change. Hopefully a little more positive and opportunistic talk. Let me first start about who HP is. With a portfolio that spans printing, personal computing, IT infrastructure, IT services, HP is the 11th largest company in America, and we operate in more than 170 countries. We had revenue of $113 billion through 4 quarters ending July 31st this year. And with the acquisition of EDS, we have more than 320,000 employees. HP has unprecedented reach. We enable more than 200 mobile phone subscribers. We handle 2 out of 3 credit card transactions. We power 106 out of the 120 stock exchanges. And more than almost half of all printers sold in the world are HP. So we operate at a scale which means small changes can have a massive environmental and social impact. I wanted to share this context with you to illustrate both HP's obligation and opportunity to lead in this area. HP's response to climate change is a part of global citizenship at HP. And we have 3 pillars that make up global citizenship: corporate accountability and governance, social and environmental responsibility, and community investment and involvement. Within corporate accountability and governance, that's where we have our code of business conduct and how we deal with our contractors and our partners and our customers. We also have privacy around how we control our customers' information. Within social and environmental responsibility, the organization or part of the organization that I'm involved in, we have innovation around our products to make them efficient with resources and energy. We have stewardships. We have product stewards throughout the company that work with design teams that help at every step of the stage of the design to advocate and to put in environmental attributes for those products. And today we have some of those product stewards here from our Corvallis campus. We have about 15 on site. We also work with our supply chain because we extend our corporate responsibility and environmental stewardship with our supply chain. The majority of our HP environmental staff are focused within this pillar. And for those of you that may be looking for jobs, these kinds of individuals typically have a multidisciplinary background. We're also incorporating more methodologies that use life cycle assessment and economic input and output modeling, which would enable us to evaluate and compare different technologies, different materials, and to make better environmental choices for our products. Finally, community investment and involvement. We focus on social investment, enabling our employees to volunteer in the communities in which they live, and also advocate for public policy. HP's been in Corvallis for 35 years. We regularly measure our progress and our performance against our environmental goals. And for those of you that want more information, I would encourage you to go to hp.com, where we have our global citizenship report, typically a 100-page plus report that we publish annually, where we describe all of our work in this area. Few companies can match the legacy of corporate citizenship. Bill Hewlett and Dave Packard were pioneers in recognizing that beyond making a profit, a company has the responsibility to enrich the businesses, the lives, the communities of its customers, of its partners, of its employees and stakeholders. And for nearly 70 years, we've strived to be an economic, intellectual, and social asset to each community in which we work and live. So given any topic within global citizenship, there's a continuum with regards to what level of response you may choose. And this is a level of response from risk to opportunity. So do you just want to do what's legally compliant? Do you want to do what is required for market access? Do you want to do just to stay competitively, to respond to competitive risks? Or do you want to try to build your brand, or build your stakeholder value, or create some business opportunities? So HP focuses on the opportunity side of this continuum in delivering business value that builds the brand and stakeholder value and solutions that will reduce our customers' footprint. Now let me share with you HP's climate strategy. Bit of a busy slide, but if you stay with me, I'll walk you around it. So starting on the left, HP-owned operations, you must first begin with putting your own house in order. To credibly advocate for a low-carbon economy, we must lead by example and reduce the carbon footprint of our HP-owned operations. The order of magnitude size of this footprint is 2 to 4 million tons of carbon. So moving to the top, HP products and services, you must then reduce the product impact, or the impact of your products and services, from design to manufacturing to distribution. Through our Design for Environment program and our product stewards, we identify, prioritize, and recommend improvements for products during design, and we focus on energy efficiency, materials innovation, and design for recyclability for its eventual end of life. HP also leads its supply chain and logistics providers to self-report emissions and establish goals and reductions. The size of this footprint is on the order of 50 to 80 million tons of carbon. So as you move to the right, the low carbon economy, as you develop products and services, you want to develop those products and services that enable your customers and users to reduce their footprint. And this is where the bigger opportunity is. Technology stands to reduce the carbon footprints in all sectors of the economy through automation, digital transformation, and substitution. And the size of this footprint, putting it in the same units as the other magnitude, is 30,000 million tons of carbon. Finally, the last bullet on the bottom is really to advocate for effective public policy to enable the transformation of the economy to low carbon. So how are we executing on this strategy? Well, let's first look at how we're reducing the footprint of our operations. HP will reduce its absolute energy consumption of its facilities by 16% from 2005 levels by 2010. And we will do this despite acquisitions and growth. So that EDS acquisition, it's going to be a pretty big challenge for us. So to do this, we're employing many of the same features internally that we offer our customers, such as data center consolidation, energy efficient servers, and smart cooling. For example, the data center consolidation project, we took 85 worldwide data centers within HP and we consolidated them down to 6. This reduced the energy consumption by up to 350 million kilowatt hours annually. HP is also consolidating its office space, optimizing its printing infrastructure, moving from CRT monitors to flat screen. We're also doubling the amount of global purchase of renewable power by 2012. And then finally, HP works to build a company culture in which its employees are educated about the environment and are rewarded for innovative ideas to reduce HP's environmental impact. To demonstrate accountability and transparency in our operations, HP provides external visibility and reporting and disclosure. And here's a few of the registries and places where we do that reporting. So as a transition in speaking about how we're reducing the footprint of HP's products and services, I'd like to look at how the IT industry has increased its efficiency over the last 30 years. So if you look at this table, we have products on the left, a functional metric in 1978, the same functional metric 30 years later this year, and what the change in efficiency is. You can see cars have really only gained in about 40% efficiency. Lighting with compact fluorescent bulbs have done a little over 300% improvement. But computing, we win this with 1,400 instructions per second in 1978, now to 40 million instructions per second per watt, which is a 2.8 million% increase. So that's a great story for improving the efficiency of our products. Let me give you some examples of how HP is doing it on some specific products. From the computer chip to the data center, we are constantly looking for ways to improve product energy efficiency and are working to educate our customers about the effects of power consumption. For example, in personal computing, we have a few different power management options which enable like a sleep mode, a standby mode, a passive, and an active mode. And when you enable these power management functions for like a TouchSmart PC, which I'm hoping that is on everybody's Christmas list this year, you would save up to 86 kilowatt hours per year enabling those power management options. We also have many products that are Energy Star efficient, which is an EPA label that defines thresholds for efficient products. We also focus on using high efficiency power supplies, which is a big part of where the energy is consumed. We also look to design low power components so that they reduce the amount of consumed energy in the products as well. And by using these technologies, by 2010, HP's volume PCs will use 25% less energy. So continuing on other products and services, printing, we have similar power management modes for our printers, but I think the biggest story is that the paper represents about 70% of the footprint of printing. So by doing double-sided printing or duplex printing, you actually can have a significant reduction of your footprint of printing. Third, recently this year, earlier this year, we disclosed how we're taking recycled plastic from used cartridges and blending that with some additives and putting it back into new cartridges. And we've done this into 250 million cartridges up to this point. Finally, around data centers and servers, we've developed dynamic smart cooling, which is a technology that enables putting the cooling where it needs to be and putting the heating where it needs to be, and doing that in a way as the data center is being used, so it's not over capacity in terms of the cooling or the heating. And that saves up to 40% of the energy in most data centers, as well as using efficiency techniques such as virtualization and data center consolidation, which really focus on using better utilizing the capacity within that data center. Finally, around how we work with our supply chain, HP operates the largest IT supply chain in the technology industry, and we extend our commitment to corporate, social, and environmental responsibility to our supply base. 75% of our supply chain is located in Asia, so it's critical to be able to understand and to work with other cultures in a way that provides for mutual benefits. How we work with our suppliers specifically on logistics, for moving shipments from air to sea. We're also focusing on reducing the packaging. If we can get more units on a pallet, we both save the shipping cost as well as the materials using the packaging. Around supply chain emissions, it was an IT company first where we disclosed the aggregated emissions of our largest suppliers in September of this year. And that was a representation of both setting expectations with our supply chain and also providing transparency to our stakeholders about what the size of our supply chain aggregated emissions are. So that summarizes a few of the highlights about how HP is reducing its embedded energy in our products. I'd now like to focus on how IT equipment can reduce the energy of our customers in the larger economy. The pie chart here on the left represents all of global carbon emissions. And when I was talking about the embedded energy in terms of the manufacturing and the logistics of our products, for the whole IT industry, that represents about 2% of the global footprint. So what I'd like to talk about is the opportunity for technology to really focus on that 98% of the pie and make it more efficient. There's several publications that have been produced this year, one by the WWF, that has talked about the opportunity for information and communication technology to have an impact. ICT strategies could reduce up to 15% of global emissions in 2020 against a business as usual baseline. So that means using what we know today, using the technology that we have today, with the infrastructure that we understand today, we can have a 15% efficiency improvement just by employing those technologies. Finally, there probably is no other sector where the opportunities for the services provided hold such a reduction potential as for the IT industry. So there's a huge opportunity for technology to increase the efficiency of the greater economy. And let me give you some examples. First, around automation. What is automation? It's really using technology to better manage systems so that you're reducing the overcapacity. Smart buildings is an example where you first focus with the design and construction for that particular, for the environment of where that building is located and how it's used, and then focusing on the operation around the heating and the lighting and the ventilation that enable it to be more efficient. Smart logistics around network optimization. You know, if you can manage your network or your collection so that you give a preference to right-hand turns, for example, you can actually do the network much faster than if they have to have left-hand turns. Collection and delivery from the aspect of trying to manage so that your truck is never empty. You're never coming back with an empty truck by managing your collection and delivery. And route planning in terms of understanding the traffic patterns and managing your route collection in a way that you mitigate the impact from traffic. Smart power delivery around our power grid has been set up with huge generation and then a distribution network. And part of the challenge is that there's usually overcapacity built, and because of the lack of automation and sensing and management of that distribution, energy is lost. It also has a hard time handling the variable generation of like solar and wind power, and by having a smart power delivery, we can more efficiently mitigate the loss of energy and transmission, as well as better accommodate local generation of alternative energy. Last slide on the second slide. So digital transformation. So what is digital transformation? It's really moving atoms to bits. And some examples that you're well familiar with: digital music, digital photos. You can create, edit, and consume those all in a digital form without printing in a physical form or putting a CD or a record player to enjoy the music. Electronic transactions, banking. There's so much you can do online. I think I just did my DMV tags just this last week. It really enables to do things electronically and mitigate some of the physical processes that you normally would do. Digital printing is an area where HP is positioning to make an impact. Analog printing today makes up over 90% of the pages that are printed. Newspapers, magazines, catalogs. And the way analog printing works is that it's very expensive to set up, but once you set up, you run as many pages as you need, and you actually overrun so that you never run out, because you don't want to set it up again. And so as a result, you end up having a lot of waste. Digital printing can enable more print on demand because the cost to set up is not there, as well as you can customize the content so that rather than having the same content for everybody, you could have content that was targeted for particular customers. Okay, last slide around creating a low-carbon economy, this one around substitution. Substitution is where we're actually using technology to replace what we've normally done in more of a physical sense. Examples there is really research and getting information off the web. The advantage is it's there 24 hours a day. You don't have to worry about it being checked out or lost. It's a huge advantage. Shopping, you can do research without getting in your car and driving around to different places. Communication, what would we do without email? As well as news. Much of our news we now get off the internet. Finally, virtual collaboration and telecommuting is a huge advantage, which would mitigate travel. And I have a slide about a technology that HP has been leveraging since 2005, which is the Halo Virtual Collaboration Studio. And this is a technology where it gives you the sense that you're in a meeting with somebody else in a similar room, but that room could be halfway across the world. It improves the business effectiveness of global teams, mitigates the travel, mitigates the challenges of catching up to that time zone, mitigates the loss of productivity of those individuals that have to travel. In the first year, one application saved 5.5 million miles, 1,100 metric tons. And HP is really embracing this technology. We're adding 100 rooms to our own operations. This is also technology that we're selling to other Fortune 500 companies, and it's becoming a huge success. Finally, the last part of the strategy is advocating for a low-carbon economy. We do this from two aspects. We focus both on the embedded energy around standards for products such as the Energy Star, guidance for data centers. We also are focusing on the low-carbon economy, more broader policy debate about how IT could be leveraged as a part of the solution. HP was also a signatory to the Bali Communique, which is a comprehensive, legally binding framework that the United Nations would use to tackle climate change. It has emission reduction targets that would be guided primarily by science. It would also focus on the industrialized countries kind of taking a leadership role there. And the idea is to put something in place ahead of the sunsetting of the Kyoto Protocol. We also participate in key policy groups such as these listed here, which includes the World Wildlife Fund's Climate Savers. So, last slide. Thank you guys for hanging in there. Sorry we started late. So what is HP's corporate response to climate change? It's a holistic approach. We first start with emission reductions in our operations. We focus on our product's efficiency and solutions for our customers. We focus on enabling those products within a strategy that will reduce the footprint of the overall economy. And we focus on advocating for appropriate public policy and collaborating with others, both technology partners, our industry, as well as NGOs such as the World Wildlife Fund. We work with the Wildlife Fund to develop energy efficient measurements for our products. We develop goals with them, and we will publicly report on the progress against those. We also define and implement measurements across our product categories. We also define and implement educational efforts to address climate change, which is a part of this Roadshow effort. We also advance thought leadership with the WWF to visibly demonstrate the role of technology and HP products in conservation and in changing consumer behavior to enable a low-carbon economy. I thank you for your attention, and I think we're now at a place where we can answer questions.
My question's for Jay. 60 Minutes just did a piece last week on e-waste, and I got to think that for every computer I've bought, I've gone through at least 2 printers, and that stuff just goes into some heap, and it looks like it's a big problem. And the other thing is, if you go to a store and say my computer or my printer doesn't work, they'll say, well, it costs about $90 to have our tech look at it, or we can sell you this new printer. Is there anything HP's doing on that regard?
We audit down to the 3rd tier supplier to ensure that the products that we take back and we recycle don't end up in those informal networks that you saw on CNN. In terms of trying to repair your product, that's a great way to go. And you might need to go to a local repair shop to try to do your best with that. I would encourage that to use your computer as long as you can. But at the end of the time, when you're ready to recycle it, HP will protect your data. It will. We have standards that we adhere to worldwide regarding our product take-back program, and so products that come to us are not the ones that we saw on CNN.
Other questions?
We explain things very thoroughly.
We have one.
My question is for Jay. You've spoken about combining call centers and combining production facilities, and I know recently HP has had some cutbacks. With the current state of economy, how does HP strike the balance between combining call centers and having that community involvement and having such an impact of reducing the jobs within the local economy?
That's a good question. I might have misspoke, but I was focusing on the consolidation of actually data centers. So we had 85 data centers where we managed data with server farms, and we consolidated those to 6. But I think the point that you're making is how do you manage supporting your communities when there are costs, there are workforce reductions, and that's a huge challenge. We're in a very competitive business where price differences of $10 or $15 can mean that you significantly impact your business. And so there are several managers at HP that are trying to balance those choices. Certainly, when you let go of committed and dedicated and experienced employees, that's a huge cost. And so HP does not take that lightly, and I think over their history, they've been deliberate about what choices they're making, and they're focusing on what they do. It's in our culture to be honest and direct, but also supportive of our employees as well as our communities. Thank you.
Question for Dr. Matthews. Among the many policy strategies that we might consider as a nation, and among the strategies that individuals can pursue, are there some that strike you as the most obvious places to turn as we start trying to do something about this problem?
That's a really good question. Well, certainly, as a nation, we really, the U.S., I travel a lot. In the past year, I've traveled about 200,000 miles by airplane. That's a carbon footprint, by the way, of about 30 tons. And I meet with people that are at a fairly low level, with up to pretty high policy makers. So I feel like I have a reasonable sense of where policy is globally and how the U.S. kind of fits into that scene. And right now, the U.S. looks like a really bad guy. The U.S. is not very popular globally on climate change issues. And we haven't been for a while. It's not just the last 8 years, it actually goes back farther than that. And one of the first things that we really need to do, I think, and I'm not spouting WWF policy, I'm spouting John's opinions, is I think that we really need to make sure that we start to argue with people that are on the right side of the climate change debate, and really make sure that we're doing a lot of very active things to reduce carbon emissions in particular within the U.S. And also something that kind of a trendy phrase right now is technology transfer. And that usually has two meanings, which is we know how to do some things in a really clean way that other countries don't know how to do in terms of carbon emissions. But we also know how to do some things that are maybe important from an adaptation perspective in a really useful or efficient way that would help improve the lives of other people, that we should also get involved in transferring that technology too. So using much more efficient irrigation systems, for instance, is something that a group like USAID, which is the federal government's development branch, is starting to they've been kind of surreptitiously doing this under out of the explicit awareness of most of the executive branch for the last decade or so. But they really need to push that a lot harder in a very active way. So in terms of how, I think probably the shortest answer is we need to start looking like the good, helpful guys in the block again. And that we do know stuff and we know how to figure out stuff. I'm encouraged, for instance, that some of the technology development firms that were behind the tech boom in the late 90s and early aughts have started to get really interested in looking at very efficient energy mechanisms. But there's also a lot of no-brainer stuff that doesn't require extensive technology development that we can start to help people with immediately. Does that answer your question?
This is a question for Jay. The cap and trade system, which is the policy of carbon trading credits, it's currently in effect in Europe right now, and it seems to be going in the right direction. The United States still has not embraced it, although they are thinking about implementing it. But some of the corporations in the United States today do use this policy at a voluntary basis with limited effects. HP being such a big company, are they taking part in the policy of cap and trade carbon credits?
Not today. So today in the U.S. we have a cap and trade voluntary system out of Chicago. In Europe, the companies that are involved predominantly, they're all power generating electrical utilities, and so it's not really something that's part of other types of industry today. We expect that's going to change potentially, and so we're kind of waiting and seeing. But right now, it's probably a few years away.
I actually have two questions. The first one's about for Jay about smart grid technology. Could you talk a little bit about that and how HP is enabling that?
I can't. It's outside what I'm currently doing, and I don't have the details about what aspects we're working on. But it is an area where technology can provide a huge advantage.
My other question is for both Jay and John. Corvallis is a really small community. We don't have a lot of Fortune 500 companies here and don't have a lot of monetary resources to implement the changes that you're talking about. So what are some ways that the local small businesses can implement some changes to help our community?
Well, we can probably each sort of answer from our own perspectives. One of the things that I think that people in Corvallis are already, many people are already very mindful is their kind of extended carbon footprint, that if you're purchasing something, you're getting an apple that's from New Zealand, then it is actually comes with a big carbon debt that's attached to it. That somebody had to put it on a plane flight to you, and then there was a bunch of overland transport. You know, these are the sorts of issues that are described really elegantly in books like The Omnivore's Dilemma. I think also from an adaptation perspective, you know, people that we're relatively sheltered also in Corvallis right now, and in the Willamette Valley we have an excess of water. Especially tonight. But I think we need to be actually quite mindful about what that water really represents. The electricity that we're basking under at the moment is also water. We need to think about that there's a cost, there's an ecosystem cost that's associated with that water. We should use it humbly and efficiently, and that's local. That's not thinking about ecosystems in New Zealand or the global atmospheric carbon cycle in your New Zealand apple. And I think maybe the most relevant way to think about that is that the decisions that you are making right now are going to have a really important impact on what the climate, how hard the climate landing is going to be for your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandkids, and probably for a couple of generations after that. That may not be a very, very happy spin, but you know, the people, some of the most worried people that I know on the planet are people that are working in climate change issues, because they see just how bad things are going to be. they go to the places that are on the edge right now, and they see the bad stuff coming. And most of us are pretty freaked out. So the mitigation is really critical, and maybe it's an ethical thing right now until we really start to shift our economy into a low carbon direction. But I think when your grandkids look at you in a couple of decades and say, "What did you do back then?" then you want to look at them with as clean and as pure a soul as you can.
I think it's important to be informed and then to make deliberate choices, and to have some community kind of incentives. At HP, we have there's a bike challenge that online bike challenge on the website thing. But that's a motivation to try to create some camaraderie around doing the right thing, using public transportation or biking and work. I think those are the things that if we stay in denial and we don't recognize the results of our choices and our actions, then I think that's the first step. We need to be informed. We need to understand the impact of our choices. And then we need to change the approach.
My question is for Dr. Matthews. You're kind of in a unique position with your water resources background and your World Wildlife Federation commitment. And you mentioned dams and hydroelectric power. And as we move into the future and what we have ahead of us, it seems like possibly those are things that we need to begin to reconsider. And I wondered if you could elaborate on that.
No, that's an excellent question. It's one that I come across quite a bit. So there are times when climate adaptation is in conflict with climate mitigation. And right now, most of you probably never heard before tonight the term climate adaptation. And when you've thought about climate change, it's just been impacts that you've heard about, or it's been things, climate mitigation like Kyoto Protocol or some of what Jay was talking about. But I think right now, in terms of policy circles, we see climate mitigation kind of winning most of the battles. And some of those battles right now are things like hydroelectric power. One of the places that I visited last April was northern India in the foothills of the Himalayas. And in Uttarakhand state, where I was, the Indian government is building 180 hydro power plants in that one state. And they're building them really rapidly. They started them just a few years ago. They've got at least 90 that are half done or some stage of construction, and they have financing for the other 90. They're not asking anybody, they're just building them. But they're not really doing a very good analysis of what's actually happening with to that water. At both before it gets to the hydro plants and what happens afterwards. And in terms of what happens before there, those glaciers are going as fast as any on the planet. They're really losing them, and the snowpack is changing extremely rapidly. And the seasonality of the snowpack is changing quite a bit. Very similar changes to what we're seeing in the Cascades and the Coast Range and the Rockies, but at a much more accelerated rate. And then downstream, these plants really they alter the hydrology. They alter the flow regime of all of these streams and creeks and rivers. And so, as a climate adaptation person who's interested in what happens to that river in 50 or 100 or 300 years, I say, we need to think really hard. Maybe we need to make some really difficult choices about where we're putting those hydro plants. Maybe we should basically say, this river is going to be toast. We'll put all the dams on that river. We'll cascade them, and we'll just dam that river to hell. And we'll say that's one that we know this is clean power, that it's low carbon emission power, but we're going to sacrifice that river. but we're going to save these other ones. We're going to help them adapt and remain healthy or enter some new healthy state, probably a better way to say it, over the coming decades and centuries. So those are really difficult choices. They're complicated choices. And right now, I would say that in most policy circles that I'm aware of, that the level of sophistication about the argument about mitigation versus adaptation is not there yet. So right now, mitigation's winning those arguments, but I suspect that in most parts of the world, within about 10 years, adaptation is going to start to win, and it's probably going to win all the arguments at that point. We'll have probably a continuous series of Katrina-like events that, really shift the awareness in the public and policy circles. That hopefully will allow more thoughtful use of adaptation-friendly mitigation. Fingers crossed.
Shall we take one more question? Maybe two.
Thank you. Thank you. There's one aspect of this that I've never really been able to reconcile in my head, and I'll say this as someone who has recently moved to Corvallis and lots of other places around the country. And when you go outside of Corvallis, my experience is that there is more societal, or there has been historically more societal resistance to some of the ideas associated with climate change. And as a subset of the societal resistance, there's also extreme corporate resistance to the idea that we're creating some pretty profound changes. And I was just wondering if you could comment on that. Why has there been societal resistance and corporate resistance? When we've in fact known for a long time about these processes, why has there been that resistance?
I think there's skeptics that have argued against the science, and I think that's colored some of the corporate response, and I think particularly in Oregon, where we had the spotted owl that impacted some of the forests that were open to logging. You've got this struggle between, tree huggers and people, having given that kind of a label to anything that was kind of green. And so I think sometimes it's hard to educate and overcome some of those stereotypes to create a more thoughtful and long-term rational conversation. I think those are some of the things. I think another thing is, from a corporate standpoint, it stands to where that corporation may be at risk or benefit from climate change in terms of how they internalize that in their own organization. And so, an organization that sees it as a threat will maybe be in denial and try to act like they're in denial and resist it to the extent until it's undeniable. So that may be one of the things. I think HP is an example where we think we have an opportunity to create a solution and to help mitigate some of the challenges. And so we're embracing the opportunity to try to be that solution.
I'm a conservation biologist, like yourself, and I think sometimes conservation biologists and scientists generally can be our own worst enemy. We're often so focused on science that it's often difficult for us to be able to communicate really complicated issues to people that they don't understand the direction that you're coming from. And I think that there are two. In the climate change world, I mean, the first modern climate change paper was published around 1970, 1971, but the science is really old. I mean, Napoleon had a couple of advisors, actually, that said to him around 1805 that, this whole Industrial Revolution thing, we think it may turn out badly. We think it's going to do weird stuff to the weather. And they were right. And actually, like in terms of the atmospheric chemistry, that was worked out in the 1880s and 1890s. So some of it's really old science. It's not much of it's not that complicated in terms of science, But, you know, in terms of most scientists now, you know, we tend to either throw a lot of facts at people instead of talking about issues or trying to educate people about up to some level, or we have a really unfortunate tendency to frighten people. And I think frightened people make really bad decisions. I think worried people make better decisions. I think the other part of that is that you know, the message about climate mitigation, climate adaptation is a message that it's hard to escape hearing. You've been doing stuff wrong for a long time, and unfortunately, that is part of the message, that we have been doing stuff wrong for a long time, and we should have known better. But we need to make changes. They need to be rather large and profound at this point, and you know, most people don't like to make those kinds of changes, and it's terrifying, and it makes you angry, and it's pretty scary. It's a much safer place to be able to say, this is a future problem. I don't want to have to change my life. I don't want to make tough decisions. So there's a part of me that would really like to blame the public. I think that actually most of the blame lies somewhere between policymakers, journalists that take this as a very superficial story in the U.S., some other countries too, but mostly in the U.S., and scientists that, like myself, can err on the side of being a little too geeky. So.
Okay, one last question.
This is kind of a statement or a question. You can take it. As we adapt in the world today, there's so many different influences that we have and places that we got to look forward. I know I enjoyed both your presentations very well. I know during one of the presentations you gave a marquee or a key hit to use or to buy those new computers coming out by energy proficient for sure. But we do know that there is a lot of technology and things that go into them that cost further environmental issues. But my question is, in all the world and all the different advertisements and other things that we have coming out of it, who to trust and where to look for the truth? I read somewhere that in the first Earth Day came around because they worried about global cooling was effect, and their ideas was to emit greenhouse gases up in the atmosphere. And if we would have done that, what type, or is that correct, or do you know, or have you heard?
It's not true.
Not true?
It's not true.
Okay.
No, there was a period in the late 70s and early 80s when there were several journalists that had a very superficial look at some scientists' work that the scientists did not actually endorse, that said that there might be a period that we might be about to enter another glacial period. But it was never a major part of the scientific community, and but it made it kind of a cool story. Oh, we're about to enter a new ice age. That's really interesting. We're going to have glaciers rolling across Iowa again. But that's not. Your larger question, I think, is important though. Where do we find information that we can really rely on and that seems valuable and useful? And that's a difficult question, actually. The way that journalists work in the U.S. is they tend to not have a regular beat. They tend to flit around a lot. And so the climate story, both perspectives, mitigation and adaptation, is a complicated story. And it takes a while to learn it and let it sink in. And the implications are really important, and we need to understand them. I think the BBC does a pretty good job. NPR had a pretty good series on climate change that I thought was very, very useful. New York Times often, not always, but often covers climate change in a subtle way. There are a few sources that have in the U.S. in particular that have done a pretty good job. But you have to be really careful about being able to sort of, I think one of the things that journalists in this country tend to focus on is they listen to the scientific noise, like I was talking about earlier, should we focus on the mean change in climate, or should we focus on the variability? I think the variability is more important from an adaptation perspective. From a journalistic perspective, we should look at the mean. And the mean says that the science is incredibly solid about what's happening and when it's happening and the changes that have already occurred. In terms of specific predictions about what's going to happen and when they're going to occur, there's going to be a lot of argument about that. There's going to be a lot of variation around the mean. But think, listen for the mean. Listen for that middle argument through multiple media sources. And know that changes are coming and that you need to be ready for them, and that the basic principle that we have to make changes in our lives now to reduce our carbon footprint is an incredibly urgent message.